Hi, everybody. Welcome to our presentation that is recorded and asynchronous, like many of our classes, I think. I'm Priya Prasad. I'm at the University of Texas at San Antonio.
And I'm Dana Olanoff, and I'm at Widener University, which is outside Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
And we're going to talk about some ways in which we leverage technology to promote collaboration in our courses for prospective elementary and secondary math teachers.
So Priya and I are both math teacher educators at different universities. We work in the math department, so we end up teaching some general math courses as well as courses that are designed to prepare prospective elementary, middle, and secondary teachers. So like many of you, we were forced to move online in the spring of 2020, and we wanted to be able to do some of the same things that we did during our regular face-to-face classes, honor what we would call our pedagogical commitments. And those involved collaborative small group learning, equitable participation for all of our students, and having our classrooms be a safe place for students to make mistakes. When we moved online in spring 2020, we were forced to pivot very quickly. We ended up doing a lot of video lectures and asynchronous lectures, and it didn't work for us. We found that the great discussions that we were having during classes were not able to be replicated. The group work, the places where students were making mistakes, and then you could ask them questions. None of that was happening in an asynchronous manner in the way that we were doing it at the time. And as a result, our grading ended up taking forever. Especially, I will collect classwork, and when students in normal times, we would have gone over everything during class. So correcting the classwork was just a little check, yep, they did it great. Well, when they were watching videos and then doing classwork, they were making all the mistakes that they normally make during class, but the time to go over them was when I was grading it, and I had to make so many comments, and I just knew it wasn't working. So I talked to Priya and I said, we need to change this. I need to change this. She was feeling the same way, and so we did.
So I was lucky in that I was actually teaching a class summer 2020, and we really had the opportunity at that point to advocate for the format of the class. And so we very much strongly pushed at UTSA, at least for our pre-service teacher classes, to be synchronous over Zoom, and have attendance in the class be counted by being in the Zoom meeting. But once we were there was this question of, all right, we know we have breakout rooms in Zoom that we can use. What next? How do we do the group work, right? How do we give them assignments and have them have something that they can talk about and all see together? So that was where Ava Thanheiser came to our rescue, because she was working on that from an asynchronous perspective and using Google Slides. And just a little bit of extra research led us to Teresa Wills, who has been working on this for about 10 years now in teaching math online in very collaborative ways. So what we settled on is as our base strategy was to use Google Slides to facilitate group work in breakout rooms. We would set up group slides, a multiple slides, one for each group, and they'd all be identical except for different group numbers. And that would be what the students would work on. We use some other tools as well, including Google Jamboards, GeoGebra Classroom, and some virtual manipulatives, all of which we will talk about.
So Google Slides was definitely our our lifesaver. It allowed us to have our students not only work in groups in the breakout rooms, which when we just sent them into breakout rooms and then said, do something and come back, we never really knew what was happening. So with the Google Slides, when we set these up, each group had their own Google Slides and they were typing into them as they were working in the breakout rooms. And not only were they typing into them, but I could type into them. So if a student miscounted something or put an answer that, you know, was a typical wrong answer that I would normally expect, I could say, hey, check out question 2B a little bit. Did you consider this? And it gave me an opportunity to communicate with them without having to even enter the breakout room. They could see what I was typing on the slide. They could go and make changes and kind of learn in the moment, which is what I would normally do when I would walk around the classroom. I could see if I needed to visit a group that was like really struggling, I could see which groups were struggling and go visit them while letting the other groups have something to do. And another thing that I was able to take advantage of a lot was having students ask anonymous questions. I would have a question slide as like the second or third slide every day where students knew they could type things in, like, can you go over number 4 on the homework? And then I would pull it up and use my annotations in Zoom to talk about it. I would ask questions with the class and then just take a screenshot and pop it right into the slide. And all of these things were part of the record for our class that my students could refer back to, I could refer back to, like to say, oh, what happened today? Or, oh, there was a group that was really struggling. Maybe I should go check in with them and make sure. And I have this record. My students use it when they're doing their homework or when they're doing their tests. I say, go back to our Google Slides to study. And so this was such a difference to be able to do this than what I had to do in the spring.
So one other strategy that we really used the Google Slides for, or I did, was something called silent discussion. And this was created by a master's student of mine called Cindy Caddy, who's a high school teacher here in San Antonio. And this was a way to make these discussions and the small group work more equitable, especially when we were having discussion-based classes. And in the fall, I taught something that was for pre-service math and science teachers, but was largely a discussion class. And this strategy took, you had a Google slide and it was cut up into 4 pieces, and each like corner had a name in it that's been blanked out, but you can see that on the top left. And there was a prompt that they were asked to respond to, and they had to respond in writing. So what this meant is that if students didn't have webcams or microphones, instead of not being able to participate in the moment with their classmates who did have microphones, or, you know, so that, you know, they'd be maybe typing into the Zoom chat, but it was always at a lag. And who knows if somebody was looking at or seeing the chat or what. In this way, everybody was quiet, right? They wouldn't talk. They would just write their response to the prompt into the Google slide. And then after some period of time where they could just write their response, there was a point where I let them free to read each other's responses and add connections, thoughts, ideas. So all of these little speech bubbles, arrows, those sort of things that you're seeing here are all responses from other people in their group, right? So you'll notice that they sometimes use the arrows to make connections between things or point specific things out. And so this was a really great way for all of that interaction to happen. It very much preserved sort of the small group aspect, even if I didn't let them go into breakout rooms, right? I could do this while keeping everybody in the main room but everybody was quiet, so it's not like people were talking over each other. And everybody had space, literal space, literal area to talk. And I could track the participation very clearly from that. And more importantly, I actually could see what every single student was saying in response to the prompt, which, you know, in normal small group discussions, you can only keep track of whoever's talking in whichever group you're actually listening to at the time. Here, I had a really nice visual record of what everybody was saying, and I could always go back if I wanted to see what a particular student was saying in response to a particular prompt. Here it was. So one of the other things we used was Google Jamboards. And this was especially in classes for the pre-service elementary teachers. And so instead of handouts, normally I would have handouts that I would give to them every day in class. A lot of times there were like visual representations or pictures on them that they had to interact with in some way. Instead, we just put them on the Google Jamboards. The reason we're using the Jamboards is they work a lot like the slides, except for they allow for more drawing, and students can generate visual representations much more easily. This example I've given here, you can see that we've given them, you know, non-standard shapes on grids, and their assignment was to find areas of these shapes. And of course, they can't really use formulas to do this, so they had to find interesting ways to decompose these areas. And here they could show you clearly how they decompose these areas in a really, really nice way. I love how this group color coded everything, by the way, which is why I picked them as an example. And finally, my favorite of all of these options is actually GeoGebra Classroom. If you ever use GeoGebra, you know it's a dynamic geometry software. You can create applets and figures that are actually interactive that students can interact with to some number, to some amount. And so if you take a look, actually, this picture of a clock that I have here, this is actually a quote working clock. It doesn't tell actual time, but it can move with that slider. And I can ask students a task or a question, a prompt that asks them to interact with it. And more importantly, if you set up the activity in GeoGebra, you sign in, you set it up, you can create a GeoGebra classroom. And in that, you can actually see real time students interacting with all these pieces and what their responses are. And you can read them and evaluate how almost an entire class is doing all at once. If you need to just stop them and have them, you know, bring everybody back for a quick discussion before moving forward, you can do that. And so this is, if you've never used this before, highly recommend it.
Another thing that we took advantage of a lot was different virtual manipulatives. And so you can see we have base blocks, virtual base blocks that you could change the different bases to different bases. We used virtual number lines, virtual geoboards, and other things, virtual pattern blocks. And I really liked having these virtual manipulatives. I started searching for them as soon as we went online because I knew that I used so many manipulatives during class. And the advantage was that normally I would use the manipulatives during class and then students wouldn't have copies of them when they were trying to do things like study or homework and work with other things. But now having these free virtual manipulatives allowed my students to have access to them at any point, whenever they needed to. So if they wanted to refresh their memory of what we did, they could go to the website and redo the activity using the virtual manipulatives. And then I would have students take screenshots and paste them into the Google Slides so I could see what they were doing. But these were super helpful, and they're something that I'm going to keep having students use because they're so accessible.
So the question we're now left with forward is, how do we preserve some of these affordances that we've described from the online environment in our face-to-face classes? That's something Dana and I are definitely, I think, grappling with. I think it's something that we want to problem solve, because there are some parts of this experience that we would not want to go back for, right? Having so much more access to so many more students thinking all at once has been just really, really nice. And I feel like in some ways, even though sometimes I don't even see some of their faces, in some ways I get to know the students even more just because I see so much of their thinking across an entire class.
I can definitely see having students bring computers to class. Like, we'll still talk and move around face to face. We won't have to Zoom necessarily, but having some of these things where they still have the access, they still have virtual manipulatives, they still can use GeoGebra Classroom, they can still use Jamboards. And then I can see what more people are doing at a time. It's really helpful. So I think we're definitely thinking about what we're going to be doing in the future and how we can incorporate all the great things that we learned, and then still see our students because we miss them. So thank you so much for listening to talk. We're happy to answer questions via email. We have links to both Ava Thanheiser and Teresa Wills's materials that were very helpful to us, and they share them freely, so they would probably be very helpful to you as well. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.